A lot of this development for FGFR inhibition in bladder cancers happened in parallel. So we had studies for erdafitinib and infigratinib really happening more or less at the same time course. In the context of erdafitinib, we achieved response rates on the order of around 40%, progression-free survival of around 5 months or so. And this really triggered some enthusiasm for the compound and led to an FDA approval. I will say that there's still a confirmatory phase 3 trial of erdafitinib that we're going to have to wait on before I feel that this approval is really going to hold a lot of water. And that trial is actually comparing erdafitinib against standard chemotherapy in individuals that have previously received checkpoint inhibition. It's also going to look at the comparison of erdafitinib versus checkpoint inhibition in folks who haven't been exposed to checkpoint inhibitors to date. So I think that's an important trial. Infigratinib, in my mind, has produced relatively similar data in the sense that we see great response rates. In a very heavily pretreated population, we see response rates approximately of around 25%. Most of the patients in this early phase experience that I led, along with my colleagues at Sloan Kettering, really seemed to indicate that about 70 to 80% of patients were heavily pretreated, and despite that, we had appreciable response rates. So I've had the opportunity to lead the phase 1 clinical trial looking at infigratinib in the context of bladder cancer. This was a phase 1b study that dovetailed on a phase 1 experience that encompassed multiple histologies. And what we saw in this particular arm of the study in patients with FGFR mutated or fused bladder cancer is that we achieved response rates despite multiple lines of prior therapy in most patients of around 25%. Very, very impressive responses. In fact, I have a patient myself with bony metastatic disease that developed a complete response, which I really just haven't seen before in the context of other existing therapies, including checkpoint inhibitors. I'm really hoping that we're going to be able to look at infigratinib further in the context of advanced bladder cancer, and we certainly do have a couple of potential trial designs moving forward with this compound. So at this year's ASCO meeting, I have the privilege of having one of my fellows, in fact, present some of the subset analyses for our initial report for infigratinib. We're specifically going to look at that population of patients with upper tract disease. And this is predicated on the fact that some of our earlier work shows that upper tract disease seems to be heavily enriched with mutations and fusions in FGFR3. And perhaps those patients have a much more relevant biology driven by that molecule. What we in fact saw is that all patients in this series acquired some clinical benefit from infigratinib, either disease stabilization or response in the context of upper tract disease. And furthermore, we had about a 50% response rate. So seeing this makes me particularly excited about a plan to develop infigratinib for upper tract patients.
So let's go into more depth in terms of some of the trials that has been published and will be presented at this ASCO as well. And one of the trials that Dr. Schraub that you were involved in is a FGFR inhibitor called Infigratinib, which is a pan-FGFR, mostly blocks 1, 2, and 3, some 4 as well. That you're part of the phase 2 data as well. So can you tell us a little bit more about that data that has been published in JCO?
Yeah, so when the original data was published in the Journal of Clinical Oncology, it included 61 patients. And the first thing that I have to say is I still remember when we were discussing this study with the company that had infigratinib, and they said we're talking about 15% of a rare tumor type, so a rare finding in a rare tumor type, and how are we going to do this? And it was amazing how 61 patients were accrued in literally under 18 months. It just goes to show what collaboration across institutions can do and what these patients are motivated to do. But in the original data, there was 61 patients, and in the initial data set, the majority of patients had FGFR2 fusions, but there was a subset of patients that had other FGFR alterations. And since then, the data has been updated, and that was presented at ESMO, and that is a slightly larger group of patients, and they're actually still accruing to that phase 2 population. But the data set that was presented, the overall response rate of the entire group of just FGFR2 fusion patients was 30%, which was in a very refractory patient population, very striking. So the number of prior lines of therapy in these patients was anywhere from, they had to have received gemcitabine and platinum, but they could be anywhere from second-line therapy all the way up to any number of lines. And so to see that type of response rate in a refractory population was very exciting. And if you looked specifically at just the patients who received it in the second line, the response rate was even higher. It was 39%, which, prior retrospective data, if you look at some of the big pooled analyses, most of these patients' most of those prior responses are in the single digits.
So based on that data, there is an ongoing phase 3 study going on right now that is called the PROOF study that is comparing the standard arm of Gemesis versus the FGFR inhibitor Infigratinib, and it also allows crossover, and the primary endpoint of the study was PFS, and I believe that study is ongoing right now, and hopefully with that result, maybe the landscape of the first-line FGFR fusion-driven tumor will change. So another abstract that will be presented at ASCO on Monday is a trial done in Asia using another pan-FGFR inhibitor called erdafitinib, okay, which is a pan-FGFR inhibitor 1 through 4. So can you comment on any of the results of that?
Well, you know, this is a drug that was developed, again, and as a lot of these FGFR inhibitors are initially, across different tumor types. And there was a subset of patients with cholangiocarcinoma. And what I will say is that at this point, we have data with a lot of different FGFR inhibitors. And as you mentioned, FGFR2 fusions are clearly oncogenic drivers, and so across the board, these inhibitors, whether it be erdafitinib, infigratinib, and some of the other ones that are in ongoing studies, these are all patients that are responding,
Sure.
and they're all in the, like you mentioned, kind of 20 to 30, up to 35 sometimes percent response rate. So it's nice to see that response across different drugs, because it just shows that this is a very targetable alteration.
So the other drug that I want to mention is the drug called pemigatinib, which was presented last year at ESMO. Mm-hmm. And that was a study with 3 different arms. The first arm had an arm with FGFR fusion only, the second one with FGFR other aberrations in the fusion, and third had none of the FGFR aberration. And they presented around 45 patient study with FGFR aberration with FGFR fusion only, and the response rate was pretty remarkable at around 45%, with a very high disease control rate as well. And just like as mentioned, it seems to have activity in those subtype of tumor. And based on that promising data, once again, they're doing also a first-line study as well, comparing against Gemesis versus the pemigatinib in a patient with FGFR fusion.